Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that Netflix, which already dominates the streaming world with over 200 million subscribers, just agreed to buy HBO Max, Warner Bros. Discovery, and a massive chunk of Hollywood's content production infrastructure for $72 billion. And then the President of the United States publicly says the deal could be a problem, that he'll be personally involved in the approval decision, and that he is concerned about one company having too much market share. Now, if your first reaction is wait, can the President just decide which companies are allowed to merge? You are asking exactly the right question, because what we're watching right now isn't just a business deal. It is a collision between capitalism, regulatory power, political influence, and the fundamental question of who actually controls what you are allowed to watch. And the answers are way more complicated and honestly more troubling than most people realize. So today I want to break down what is actually happening here, why this $72 billion deal is different from normal mergers, what it means when a president can veto corporate acquisitions, whether Trump's concerns are legitimate or political theater, and ultimately what this tells us about the future of media, entertainment, and free expression in America. Because by the end of this, you are going to understand that this isn't really about Netflix or HBO Max. It is about whether we're living in a market economy or a managed economy where political leaders decide which companies get to succeed. Let's start with the deal itself, because the scale is genuinely staggering. Netflix is offering roughly $72 billion to acquire Warner Bros. Discovery, which owns HBO Max, HBO Warner Bros. Studios, CNN, Discovery Channel, TLC, Animal Planet, and a content library that includes everything from Game of Thrones to Harry Potter to 600 comics. This isn't Netflix buying a competitor's streaming service. This is Netflix buying a vertically integrated media empire. Production studios, distribution networks, news operations, reality television, prestige dramas, blockbuster franchises, everything. If this deal goes through, Netflix would control somewhere between 40 and 50% of all streaming content consumption in the United States. They'd own the production facilities where shows are made, the intellectual property rights to thousands of films and series, the streaming platforms where content is distributed, and the subscriber relationships with hundreds of millions of customers. In systems engineering terms, this is vertical integration on a scale we haven't seen in the entertainment industry since the studio system of the 1930s and 40s. And that comparison isn't accidental, because the last time media companies had this much concentrated power, the government stepped in and broke them up through antitrust enforcement. Now here is where it gets interesting and where Trump's involvement becomes significant. Under current law, mergers above a certain size have to be reviewed by federal regulators, primarily the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division. These agencies evaluate whether a proposed merger would substantially lessen competition or create a monopoly. Their job is supposed to be technocratic, analyzing market shares, consumer impacts, potential price increases, barriers to entry for competitors. But in practice, especially with deals this large and politically visible, the White House often weighs in. And Trump isn't being subtle about it. He has publicly stated the deal could be a problem, cited Netflix's huge market share, and made clear he'll be involved in the approval decision. That last part is crucial. The president doesn't technically have formal approval authority over mergers. That power belongs to independent regulatory agencies. But the president appoints the heads of those agencies, sets enforcement priorities, and can create enormous political pressure that influences whether deals get approved, blocked, or restructured. So when Trump says he'll be involved, what he is really saying is the deal won't happen unless I am satisfied with the terms. And that raises a fundamental question about how capitalism is supposed to work. Is it the government's job to decide which companies are too big, which mergers create too much power, which deals serve the national interest? Or should markets decide through competition, with government intervention only when there is clear harm to consumers? So let's analyze this from first principles. Does Netflix buying HBO Max actually harm competition and consumers? Or is this just the natural evolution of a maturing market? The argument for blocking the deal goes something like this. Right now, consumers have choices in streaming. Netflix, Disney+, HBO Max, Amazon Prime, Hulu, Paramount Plus, Peacock, Apple Television Plus. Each service competes on price, content quality, and user experience. If one company owns 40 to 50% of the market, that competitive pressure disappears. Netflix could raise prices, because where else are you going to go if they own half the shows you want to watch? They could reduce content quality, because they don't need to fight as hard for your subscription. They could pay creators less, because there are fewer buyers for content. Smaller competitors would struggle to survive, because they can't match Netflix's scale, library depth, or production capacity. Over time, you'd see job losses as redundant positions get eliminated, fewer opportunities for diverse content, because one gatekeeper controls what gets made, and higher prices for consumers who have no real alternatives. Unions are already sounding alarms about exactly this scenario. Writers, actors, production crews, they're all warning that consolidation at this scale means fewer jobs, lower wages, and less negotiating power for labor. Both Democratic and Republican lawmakers are expressing concerns, which tells you this isn't purely partisan. Democrats worry about monopoly power and corporate consolidation. Republicans worry about one company having too much control over information and entertainment, especially given Netflix's well-documented political leanings in content decisions. When both parties agree something might be a problem, that is worth paying attention to. Now here is the counterargument, and it is not without merit. The streaming market is global, not just American. Netflix faces fierce competition internationally from local providers, from YouTube, from TikTok, eating into entertainment time, from piracy, from gaming taking attention away, from video content. The idea that Netflix would have monopoly power when people can choose from literally millions of hours of content across dozens of platforms doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And vertical integration isn't inherently bad. When a company owns production and distribution, it can be more efficient. Take bigger creative risks because it keeps all the upside. Invest in quality because it benefits directly from successful shows. Disney's success with Disney Plus is built entirely on vertical integration. They own Marvel, Star Wars, Pixar, their own studio, and their streaming service. Nobody's calling for Disney to be broken up. The difference might be scale. Disney Plus has significant market share, but it is not dominant across all content categories. Netflix post-merger would be, they'd own prestige television from HBO, reality programming from Discovery, news from CNN, blockbuster films from Warner Bros., family content from Cartoon Network, sports rights that Warner Bros. Discovery holds. It is not vertical integration in one category. It is vertical integration across almost every category of entertainment, and that concentration creates risks that go beyond just pricing and jobs. It creates risks about what kind of content gets made, whose stories get told, what perspectives are represented, what political viewpoints are allowed in mainstream entertainment. When one company controls half of what people watch, the editorial decisions that company makes have enormous societal impact. And here is where Trump's concerns start to look less like protectionism and more like legitimate questions about power. Not economic power alone, but cultural and political power. Because content isn't just entertainment. It is how societies understand themselves, how values get transmitted, how political narratives get shaped. If you control the stories, you control a lot more than you might think. And the question becomes, should any single private company have that much influence? And if they shouldn't, whose job is it to prevent that concentration? The markets or the governments? Section 3. Trump's role and the precedent problem. 500 words. Now let's talk about Trump's involvement specifically, because this is where things get really complicated and potentially dangerous depending on your perspective. Trump saying he'll be involved in approving this deal isn't unprecedented. Presidents have historically weighed in on major mergers that have national significance. But the way Trump is framing it, the directness of his intervention, and his specific focus on market share creates a precedent that should make everyone uncomfortable, regardless of political affiliation. Here's why. If a president can effectively veto corporate mergers based on his judgment about market concentration, what stops that power from being used politically? What if the president doesn't like Netflix's content decisions, doesn't like their support for certain political causes, doesn't like the executives who run the company? Does he then block mergers as punishment or use approval as leverage to extract concessions? That is not capitalism. That is not even regulated capitalism. That is state-managed economy, where business decisions require political approval. And once you establish that precedent, it doesn't matter if you trust Trump to use it wisely. The precedent exists for every future president. Imagine a progressive president blocking mergers involving conservative media companies because of concerns about misinformation. Imagine any president using merger approval as a tool to reward political allies and punish opponents. That is not a hypothetical concern. That is how managed economies work. Now, Trump's defenders would argue he is not creating new power. He is using existing regulatory frameworks that have always given government oversight of large mergers. The FTC and DOJ have blocked plenty of deals over antitrust concerns. AT&T tried to buy T-Mobile, and the government said no. The difference here is the level of direct presidential involvement and the public nature of it. Normally, these reviews happen through regulatory processes that are at least somewhat insulated from direct political pressure. You have career antitrust lawyers analyzing competitive effects, economists modeling consumer harm, structured processes that follow law and precedent. When the president publicly announces he is going to be involved and makes clear he has concerns before the regulatory review is even complete, that short-circuits the process. It makes the decision political first and legal second, and that is dangerous because it undermines the predictability and rule-based nature that markets need to function. Companies making $72 billion deals need to know the rules, need to understand what makes a merger legal or illegal, need to be able to plan based on consistent standards. If every major deal requires presidential blessing based on subjective judgment about whether it serves national interests, you've introduced enormous uncertainty into capital allocation decisions. But here's the other side that is worth considering seriously. Maybe the technocratic regulatory process isn't sufficient for decisions this consequential. Maybe when you are talking about one company controlling 40 to 50% of streaming content, affecting hundreds of thousands of jobs, potentially reshaping how information and entertainment flow through society, that is inherently political and should involve elected officials, rather than just unelected regulators. The counter-argument to my concerns about presidential overreach is that at least the president is accountable to voters. If Trump blocks this deal and people think he is wrong, they can vote him out. If unelected FTC commissioners make bad decisions, there is no democratic accountability. So maybe having the president involved is actually more legitimate, more transparent, more democratic than pretending these decisions are purely technical. I don't fully buy that argument because I think the rule of law requires predictable standards that don't change based on who is in office. But I understand why people make it, especially people who've watched regulatory capture, where agencies end up serving the industries they're supposed to regulate. If you can't trust the FTC to make decisions in the public interest, maybe you need political oversight. The problem is you are trading one form of captured decision-making for another. Instead of regulators captured by industry, you get decisions captured by political considerations. Now let's zoom out and look at what this means beyond just the Netflix HBO deal, because the implications extend to how America competes globally, and whether our regulatory approach encourages or stifles innovation. Here is the uncomfortable truth. American tech and media companies dominate globally, in large part because they achieved scale. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, they became giants in the US market and then used that scale to compete internationally. European companies never achieved comparable scale because European regulators blocked consolidation much more aggressively. The result is that Europe imports American technology and media rather than producing its own competitive alternatives. Now you can argue that is because American companies are simply better, more innovative, more efficient, and there is truth to that. But it is also true that regulatory environment matters enormously. If you prevent companies from getting big enough to invest in R&D content production, global distribution infrastructure. You ensure they'll never compete with giants from countries that allow more consolidation. So when we talk about blocking the Netflix merger, we need to ask what happens to American competitiveness if we don't allow our media companies to achieve the scale necessary to compete with state-backed content producers from China, with vertically integrated conglomerates from other countries, with the next generation of platforms that might emerge. There is a real tension here between domestic competition concerns and international competitiveness. Domestically, Netflix buying HBO might reduce competition and potentially harm consumers. Internationally, it might be necessary for an American company to have enough scale to compete with ByteDance, with Alibaba, with whatever emerges next. And there is no easy answer because both concerns are valid. But here's what worries me most about this situation. The discussion is almost entirely focused on the wrong questions. We're debating whether Netflix is too big, whether the deal should be blocked, whether Trump should be involved. We're not asking the more fundamental question, which is why are we in a situation where the streaming market consolidated so rapidly that now we're choosing between monopoly concerns and international competitiveness? The answer has a lot to do with how we structured intellectual property law, how we regulated the transition from cable to streaming, how we allowed exclusive content licensing that forced consumers to subscribe to multiple services, how we let regulatory capture happen, where agencies stopped seriously enforcing antitrust for decades. The Netflix-HBO deal is a symptom of policy failures that stretch back 20-plus years. Blocking this one merger doesn't fix those underlying problems. It just means we'll face the same issues again with the next proposed consolidation. What would a smarter approach look like? Probably something that focuses less on blocking mergers and more on ensuring interoperability, preventing exclusive dealing arrangements that lock content to single platforms, making it easier for new competitors to enter the market, protecting labor rights, so consolidation doesn't just mean job losses and wage cuts. You could allow the Netflix merger, but require that HBO content also be available on competing platforms, that Warner Bros. Production facilities remain accessible to independent creators, that the combined company can't use its distribution power to crush smaller services. That would preserve the efficiency benefits of vertical integration while preventing the monopolistic harm. But that requires sophisticated regulatory thinking and continuous oversight, which is much harder than just saying deal blocked or deal approved. And most politicians, including Trump, aren't interested in that level of complexity. They want simple answers: too big, break it up; foreign competition, let it happen. The nuance required to actually solve the problem doesn't fit in a tweet or a campaign speech. So we end up with reactive, inconsistent policy that satisfies no one and doesn't address root causes. But there is one more dimension to this that we haven't fully addressed, and it might be the most important. What does it mean for free speech and diverse content creation when one company controls 40 to 50% of streaming entertainment? Because this isn't just about prices and jobs and competition. It is about who decides what stories get told, what perspectives get represented, what is considered acceptable content. Netflix already has enormous influence over content creation. Creators pitch shows to Netflix because that is where the audience and money are. Netflix's content guidelines, their preferences for certain genres and styles, their algorithms determining what gets promoted, all of that shapes what gets made. Now multiply that influence by absorbing HBO's prestige content operation, Warner Bros. Film Studio, Discovery's reality empire, CNN's news operation. You are talking about one company's editorial judgment affecting the majority of professional content production in multiple categories. And here is where it gets uncomfortable. Netflix isn't a neutral platform. They make content decisions based on their values, their business model, their perception of audience preferences. Sometimes those decisions align with what you might want to see. Sometimes they don't. But the point is, when multiple companies compete, there is diversity in those editorial judgments. What Netflix won't make, HBO might. What Warner Bros. Passes on, Amazon might pick up. That diversity is valuable, not just economically, but culturally and politically. It ensures different perspectives get funded, different voices get heard, different experiments get tried. Concentrate that decision-making in one entity, and you lose that diversity. You get optimization around what works for the largest audience, which tends to mean lowest common denominator content. Safe choices that offend no one. Algorithms determining creative decisions. And you get enormous power for one company to decide what is acceptable political speech in entertainment. If Netflix decides certain viewpoints are too controversial, too offensive, too risky, creators with those viewpoints have fewer options. The response might be, well, that is Netflix is right as a private company. And legally that is true. But when that private company controls half the market, their private decisions have public consequences. They're effectively gatekeepers for cultural and political expression, and that should concern anyone who cares about free speech regardless of political ideology. Because today the gatekeepers might share your values. Tomorrow, they might not. The institutional power matters more than the current occupants. Now, Trump's stated concern is about market share and competition, but I suspect his actual concern, and the concern of many Republicans, is about content control and political bias. They see Netflix as a progressive company that promotes certain political and social perspectives through its content. They worry that giving Netflix even more power means those perspectives become even more dominant in culture. Democrats have the mirror image concern. They worry about what happens when a president can block mergers based on dislike of a company's content. Both concerns are legitimate, and both point to the same underlying problem. We've allowed media consolidation to reach a point where these decisions matter so much that everyone's afraid of them being made by people they don't trust. So what happens next? The regulatory review will take months. Trump's administration will signal what conditions would make the deal acceptable. Netflix and Warner Bros. Discovery will likely offer concessions, divestitures of certain assets, commitments about pricing and content availability, promises about job retention, and eventually there will be a decision: deal approved, deal blocked, or deal approved with modifications. But regardless of how this specific situation resolves, the precedent is being set. We're establishing that major media mergers require presidential blessing, that market concentration in content is a political question, not just an economic one, that the line between capitalism and managed economy is blurrier than we thought, and we're confirming that whoever controls distribution increasingly controls what gets created. Which means media consolidation isn't just about business, it is about power. The kind of power that shapes societies, influences elections, determines which ideas spread and which ideas get marginalized. Maybe that power should be concentrated in one company's hands. Maybe it shouldn't. But we should at least be honest that that is what we're deciding. This isn't really about whether Netflix can afford to pay $72 billion. It is about whether we're okay with one entity having that much influence over what Americans watch, think, and believe. And if we're not okay with it, whose job is it to prevent that concentration? The markets, the governments, some combination. There are no perfect answers, but understanding what is actually at stake, understanding that this is about power, not just profits, that is the first step toward making better decisions. Because right now we're sleepwalking into a media landscape where a handful of companies control nearly everything, where presidents decide which mergers happen based on political calculations, and where the diversity of voices and perspectives that democracies need to function is quietly disappearing behind the appearance of infinite choice. And by the time most people notice, it'll be much harder to reverse.